this presentation, Jim did a really good job, if you were here for his talk, of kind of introducing how they're conducting on-farm research and the good ways to go about doing that. I want to spend some time to talk to you guys about how to look at some of the information that you see with a critical eye to help you make decisions on whether the information that you're looking at is reliable and high quality, or maybe just a little more of a sales pitch. So the things that I want to go over are the different types of information that you might encounter, and then how to identify research-based information. And then I want to spend a little bit of time when you get your handouts on how we interpret that research information that you see out there. And then towards the end, I want to spend just a brief amount of time on how to get started doing on-farm research correctly on your farm. So the types of information that we see. How many times do you guys have a question that you're just dying to know the answer to? Everybody? Especially on the farm. What sorts of questions are you asking? It's early. Did everybody have their coffee? I don't know about you, but the first thing I do when I have a question is I go straight to Google and I type it in and see what the answer is. So that's what I did for you guys. I looked up what I think the most pressing questions for on-farm research are, and I Googled them. So the first one, what corn hybrid should I use? And the cool thing about Google is that it might be difficult for you guys to see, but in just over half a second, Google gave us over 11 million results with people who have the answer of what corn hybrid we should use. So that's not our only question. That's great. We're off to a great start. So much information. So then I was like, well, what's the best nitrogen rate for that hybrid? And if you look at Google, in about 3/4 of a second, you'll get over 9 million results. And if you guys think that the trend is going to continue, you're correct. If we start talking about maybe I should put nitrogen on my soybeans, there's over 12 million people who have put something on the internet to help you answer that question. How about nitrogen stabilizers? Everybody's interested in that, right? 63 million results on Google. Best seeding rate for soybeans. This one's not quite as popular, I guess it looks like. It's only 1.5 million in half a second. And maybe, should I plant a cover crop? That's a good question for this conference. There's, again, over 1 million results in half a second. So when we start looking at all this information, how do we know out of these millions of results who's telling us the truth and what information is going to help us make the best decision on our farm? And so I think that we need to be aware that there are 3 common types of information that we might see out there, and that's anecdotal, demonstrative, and scientific. You guys can probably already guess what some of these mean. So your anecdotal information, that's sitting around, that's the stories, right? It's the good stuff. Demonstrative, sometimes that's the best one that we learn from, right? We can get out to the field and see what a product looks like, see what its impact looks like in the field. But then when we talk about scientific, that's where we should put most of our value. So that anecdotal information, it's the experiment stories. We're sitting in the coffee shop and telling stories. I have my own, right? I spent some time working for Monsanto in variety development for soybeans. So we planted 120 small plots. And my favorite story was always, well, this year when I was out there harvesting, I had one plot, those beans yielded 130 bushel the acre. And that's the story I love to tell because it's the most interesting, right? But did that variety average 130 bushels to the acre? No, just in that one trial, it got put in a good spot. It had a lucky year. It's not the same one year over year. But people are more interested and excited to hear that, and they're more likely to remember that too, right? The problem with that anecdotal information is, depending on who you're getting that information from, it may or may not be true. And even if it is true, it's likely not documented in any way, and they can't prove it. And then we have the demonstrative. I think this is really, in agriculture, this is our bread and butter, right? You guys want to get out and you want to see what something looks like in the field. So these are our hybrid comparison trials where you can walk by and take notes and check out which one is showing more disease, which one has bigger ears. And you learn by seeing. You can make visual comparisons. And I think this has a big impact, and it's good for learning. But then when we talk about those scientific results and that scientific information, this is going to be what's the most reliable for making a decision on your farm. because they're carefully set up with an experimental design that allows us to use statistics, and those statistics give us the ability to tell how much stock can we put in that result, how reliable is that, how likely will I see it again on my own farm. So I want to spend a little bit of time, and this is where it gets fun. I have to give a disclaimer at the beginning. I'm going to show you some advertisements. I'm not going to make any statement about whether or not these products work, but I want you guys to look at these advertisements with me, and we're going to talk through what the language in these advertisements is telling you and what sorts of things to look for. So the title of the talk, we had to get to this point right, is we want to see if it's science or if it's sales. And clearly, a lot of this anecdotal information is probably sales. It's not really science, so we'll throw it in that category. That scientific information, obviously, we're going to put in the science category. But there's other types of trials, there's demonstrative, that can kind of go either way. So we have to have a critical eye looking at those. So as we go through these ads, there's a couple things that I want you to look for. And the first is, as Jim was saying, it's important that we do these tests in more than one location over multiple years. So we're looking for the information coming over a variety of environments. So you don't want to just have information from one year in one spot, because how many times are you going to get that same result in a different spot or a different year? Perhaps not very often, right? So multiple locations in multiple years give us the ability to see how products or varieties perform over a wide range of environments, and that makes us more confident in predicting their performance in the future. I think it's important also to look for transparency in their experimental design. If they set it up carefully and right, you might not care, but I think it's nice to know and be able to see whether you understand the experimental design or not, that it looks like they put in the effort to do a good job. And then, again, with those statistical numbers, sometimes they're confusing, but I think it's important and it's valuable to know that the statistics were done, and in a minute, by the time you leave today, I think that you will have confidence in understanding some of those numbers, I hope. So this is our first one, and I want you guys to look at this ad together. I went through all of the magazines. Dad came home, and I had them spread all over the floor, and he's like, I thought you were working today. I was like, I'm just looking at pictures. Don't mind me. So this is the first one. It's for Acuron, and I'll blow up the text here. What this advertisement says is, last year, in 2015, we tried Acuron on a half a circle of corn. So first thing I think is, this must have been out west, because we don't plant our corn in a circle here, right? So it had to be a center pivot irrigation.
Huh? Not unless you fall asleep.
Yeah, you know. Where they're fighting glyphosate-resistant mare's tail and morning glory. We can identify with that. How many of you guys have some mare's tail that you're struggling with in your fields? All right, us too. And so they applied Acuron on half the circle and not on the other half. And we saw that our old methods on the other, we used old methods on the old half and Acuron on one. And we saw a night and day difference on the Acuron treated corn. It was completely clean. So what kind of information do you guys think this is? Do you think it's science or do you think it's sales? Sales. Good guess, guys. This clearly falls into that anecdotal information, right? Somebody's telling a story. It's convincing, right? He did a side-by-side comparison, but there's no data. There's no information about how reliable is this result. Maybe it was just a one-off. Maybe that side of the circle didn't have weeds to start with. We have no idea, right? But this is a good story that shows impact of that product, but maybe it's not reliable information. So that's sales. And then we've got this one. And regardless of what kind of seed we can find, what kind of seed you prefer, we can find ads like this for all of them. This one is for the Extend beans, and it's showing a 5.4 bushel to the acre average advantage. And so it's hard to see in the fine print, so I blew it up again. It says that this data is collected from 2015 and 16 Monsanto system trials. And then it goes on to say that that's 14 locations in 2015 and 19 locations in 2016. And then there are those statistics, right? Significant at P less than or equal to 0.05 and an LSD of 1.6 bushels per acre. So based on what I told you before, even though some of you might or may not know what those numbers mean, do you think that this is is this science-based information or is it sales? And this is a trick question, because it's an advertisement, so it's obviously sales, right? But if you looked at this, would you feel a little bit more confident that you would be able to get this sort of result on your farm based on the information they're giving you? I see a couple nods. Some of you guys are like, no, I don't believe in extend beans. So I think this is a good example of a science-based advertisement. And then this one is another one, and this is one of those gray area ones, I'll warn you up front. This is for a nitrogen stabilizer, and it says that you can get 12 bushels per acre more with End Zone. And then in the fine print, it says to go to their website, agexplorer.com, to find out more. So to save you the time, I went to the website, and what I found when I went to look for the trials for the product End Zone, it was tested at one location, in one crop, in one location, with one type of nitrogen in 1 year. And Jim said earlier, one-offs usually aren't very good, right? But maybe we'll give them the benefit of the doubt. Clicked one more time, and that location was in Union County, South Dakota, which I have no idea where that is. And it was on a clay soil with a rate of 100 pounds per acre. So how many of you guys feel like your farm is pretty similar to somebody's farm in South Dakota? Oh, good, 0 hands. See, that's kind of how I feel too. So do you guys think this is a good science-based advertisement, or do you think it's mostly sales? It's really hard. I think it's hard to tell. You had to dig down and get more information. Maybe all the data isn't on their website. There is data. They told us how they conducted the experiment, so those are positives, right? So here it gets a little tougher to tell. And I think this is why it's important to understand that just because it's a plot doesn't mean that it's research. And I think there's a clear difference when we start looking at some of the trials like what Jim was talking about earlier and some of those demonstrations that I was describing previously. And to understand the differences between these two types of plots, I think we need to understand the objectives. So when we put demonstration plots out in the field, our main goal is to demonstrate a practice that's already proven. So the science has already been done, and we just want to, mostly with education, get out there and show you, help you learn how this product looks in the field, how it performs in the field, what you might expect to see on your farm. It gives us the ability to have simple qualitative comparisons, so you can see visual differences. Like the pictures where he was showing, if you put 29 pounds of nitrogen on compared to 200, you expect one to be yellow, right? But you can see that gradient in a demonstration plot. Sometimes data is collected on this plot, off of these demonstration plots, but you need to be careful. If it's a demonstration plot that was in one location in 1 year with data, I don't think that's very reliable. But if they're using multiple demonstration plots and collecting data and aggregating it, then there's potential that that's good quality data. So again, I guess I sort of already said this, but the things that demonstration plots don't do well are, unless they're replicated, that data is not going to be reliable. And the other thing is sometimes they can get something out there that shows a really nice visual difference, but without good data, we don't really know if that equates a yield difference at the end of the season. And even if there's a yield difference, there might not be an economical benefit either. So with research plots, this is totally different than demonstrations. A lot of times we're going out there and we're trying to take a new practice and test it and find out what the impact of that practice is. So the way these are designed, it gives us the ability, with that careful experimental design, to look at quantitative differences. And using statistics, we can estimate those differences. And this data, because it's replicated at multiple locations over multiple years in a lot of cases, it gives us the ability to make conclusions from this data. What research plots aren't good for is when we want to explain to you guys how this is going to impact your farm. It's really hard to take you out and show you, unless you have a nice aerial image like Jim was showing, because they're randomized, you have to walk through, you can't really see the treatment side by side. So it makes it hard to visualize those differences. So they're great for data, but they're not so great for getting out there and educating and understanding. So you guys are starting to slip away and fall asleep already, right? So I want to do some more of this look at the ads game. So this is one for an insecticide. I think it's a soil amendment. And so let's look. I've got to find on here where to point. So it says that with this insecticide, it will increase your yields by an average of 11 bushels per acre. And That sounds pretty good. So then if you add this additional soil amendment, it's going to gain you an additional 3 on top of that. Sounds pretty good. So there's these two. There's a little tiny 1 and a little tiny 2 that takes you to the footnotes. And it says that this information is based on grower comparisons from 2006 to 2014 and 2015 grower trials. So they've tested the insecticide from 2006 to 2014. So how do we feel about that information, that 11 bushel per acre advantage with the insecticide? Scientifical. That's a good word. I like that word. I think I'm going to keep it and use it. What's a grower comparison? What do you think about when they say grower comparison? Studies on the farm. See, I think this is where, so is that different than a grower trial? This one, I have a lot of questions about this ad myself, because I don't know what the difference is between a grower comparison and a grower trial, but I don't think that they use those words differently by accident. So I feel like a grower comparison is probably less reliable than a grower trial, just based on the language. This is just my thought process as I look at this ad. I would think maybe a grower comparison is just a side-by-side. It's not replicated. It's not randomized. Whereas a grower trial to me sounds like it was probably set up with an experimental design that's replicated. Does anybody kind of have that same thought process as me? All right, so I think with this one then we see a trade-off, right? So if we say that the grower comparison isn't quite as good as a grower trial, but we have more years of the grower comparisons and only 1 year of the grower trial, I don't know which of these two is more reliable information. Is the 11 bushels more reliable than the 3 bushels? I don't really know. This is a good opportunity. This would be a good conversation to have with your salesperson about, how is this conducted? But that kind of critical thinking of looking at this can help you determine, how likely am I to get this result? So let's take a look at another one. This one's for a fungicide. And it says that we have a 15 bushel per acre increase over untreated in corn and a 7 bushel per acre over untreated in soybeans. And I think this one, it gives no information at all on that ad about how those numbers were arrived at. So does that throw up a red flag for anybody? All right, good. And the fine print's really hard to read. So this one is for a product combination, it looks like, and it's saying that we're going to get a 15.3 bushel per acre yield advantage with this insecticide and fungicide combination. And then in tiny print at the bottom, this is where all the good information always is, where you have to get out your reading glasses and hold it 5 feet away, right? And it says it was based on 2015 FMC and BASF sponsored research trials from independent research firms. So what do you guys think when you hear that? Is that generally a thumbs up or a thumbs down? In the middle? Okay. See, I like that you guys are thinking about it. I like this. This is the whole point, right? See, I don't know. See, this is another one where you're not really sure. I'll go with the sideways thumb. It's an independent research firm. That sounds good. They're not biased. I think somebody said, but it's sponsored at the last time I gave this talk. I was like, well, my research is sponsored. So this one's hard to tell, but it doesn't give us any information about how many years, how many locations. So it's hard to judge how reliable this information is going to be for you. And then we've got one. This is one of my favorites. This is for a 2-pass approach with a herbicide. And did I blow up? Okay, I didn't. It says, I have to read it and you have to listen very carefully. This one's tricky. It says, university tests show just 3 to 4 inch weeds can gobble up 12 to 13 bushels per acre in a week. Good thing Anthem Max herbicide has a huge application window, so you can start as early as 45 days pre-plant. And there was a little 1 there. So then in the fine print, it says that it is based on University of Minnesota Extension research. And so this makes you're thinking thumbs up, right? Extension does the best research. I'm not biased when I say that. But if you look at where that 1 is strategically placed, it's after the statement that university tests show just 3 to 4 inch weeds can gobble up 12 to 13 bushels per acre in a week. That research had nothing to do with the herbicide. So I think this one's it's tricky and fun. So they're showing you that there was research done, but it has nothing to do with their product. So you have to read a little careful and see where they're being sneaky. And then we've got this one where we're testing some furrow closing things, and it says research, asterisk. At least they're honest that their research is got an asterisk, right? And it shows all of these different gains that you can get with this product. So do you guys think, what do you think about this? It says that it's from Heartland Technologies and Beck's Hybrid Studies in 2015. What are we missing with this one? We're missing any kind of aggregation or statistics. They're really just giving you those single anecdotal stories, right? So one guy in Indiana got 8 bushels per acre. Two guys in Ohio got 12 and 10 bushels per acre. But it doesn't really tell you, other than that single time, you might be the guy that only gets 5. And maybe somebody got -10 and they didn't put him on the flyer, right? There's no kind of statistics that helps build up how reliable that information is. So when we're looking at all these ads, I think the main question that I want you to be thinking is, how probable is it that I'll see this same result on my own farm? And really the only way to know that, how reliable the information is by knowing that the experimental design and the statistics made it possible to isolate the noise and determine if those yield differences are real. So this is where we're going to get into some of the statistics, because I think that it's really important that there are some things that you need to understand. Statistics are boring, I know. I struggled through it too. I'm still not very good at it. But I think it's really important that we understand some of the basics to be able to judge this information in a critical way. So by the end of the day, I want you guys to leave understanding what all of these mean. So the first thing I want to talk about is statistical significance. How many has everyone heard that thrown around in the talks this week so far? Hands. All right, good, everybody. So when they're saying statistical significance, what that is really telling us is whether or not this result is real. And when we say real, when we're putting things out in the field, just like that 130 bushel per acre bean plot, there's a chance that it can end up in a lucky spot or a bad spot, and our result is due to something other than what we're testing as opposed to what our question was originally. And so statistical significance gives us the ability to sort out the noise in the field and determine, is it just random variation that's causing that yield difference, or is it actually the treatment that I'm testing? The next thing that's important is replication. So it's important that we put this out in the field in more than one spot for that same reason, right? We have to be able to sort out, did it just get put in a lucky spot and yield really well? Was the pressure that we were trying, if we're doing a fungicide, is the pressure there? And it allows us to separate out the treatment differences from that variation that's occurring in the field naturally. So for example, this is a field that's hopefully not too far from here in northwest Indiana. And I looked at that spot on the map and I picked out what I thought looked like the most uniform field where I could put plots. And I want to do a fungicide trial. So on one half of the field, I test my fancy fungicide that I paid a lot of money for. On the other side, I didn't apply it. And this looks like it could work, right? At the end of the year, we're going to see a difference. But if we overlay the soil map on there, we see that maybe we've made a mistake, right? The place where we didn't put any fungicide is a completely different soil type than the part of the field where we applied the fungicide. So maybe, if we're not careful about how we analyze that, maybe fungicide would have worked down here, but it didn't work on this soil type. So this is what replication gives us. In that same field, if we split up and instead of doing just 2 blocks, we do multiple blocks, we're able to spread out those plots and get it across the variation and get a more equal representation. And so the noise doesn't cause as much of an issue in this sort of design. The next thing that is important is to randomize. So let's take that same field, for example. And I think Jim was talking about, in some fields, there's a systematic variation. So let's say in this field, we've got a slope that's downhill. And we're testing fungicide. So maybe in this low spot at the bottom of the hill, there's just more disease pressure because there's more moisture throughout the season. So with or without the fungicide treatment, our yields are starting to trend. So we start out with 60 bushel per acre. In the next plot, we get 58. And then we're down to 54, 52, 48. Our yields are going down. And I went too far. If we don't randomize, it's impossible for us to know if that trend in the data is because of the fungicide difference, because in this case, our fungicide treatment is going to out-yield the non-fungicide treatment every time, right? But we just said that it's perhaps in this field, this is made up hypothetical, but if in this field, if our yield trend is down because of variation in that field, we would make the wrong conclusion. We would say that the fungicide worked, when in reality, the yield might have just been trending down. So randomization helps us to mix that up and make sure that we're not confounding our results with some systematic variation in our field. Now we're going to get into those statistic terms. One that you might see a lot, has anyone seen least significant difference? It's usually LSD on the research results. So LSD, just like it sounds, least significant difference is the smallest difference that is real. So we're talking about that significant difference. And the key to this is they're going to set the probability ahead of time on these trials. 95 is pretty common. Sometimes you'll see 90%. I think the Ohio State variety trials that we're going to look at in a second have 90%. And what that says is that 90% of the time, we are confident that the yield differences between these treatments are not due to random chance, that they are real. So the way we interpret that is if the difference, the yield difference that we see, is greater than our LSD, we say that it's a real difference. And if it's less than, if our yield difference that we see is less than that LSD value, we say that it's due to noise or chance. So when they say, oh, it's not significantly different, what they're really saying is there was so much variation in that field that we don't have the ability to tell if it was just the variation in the field or if it was variation in the experiment. Does that make sense? The next value that you might see is the CV, or the coefficient of variation. And this value describes the level of variation in the experiment. So we just said that LSD might be because of that variation in the field. This kind of gives us an idea of, in that experiment, how much variation was happening. So it's calculated using the standard deviation. You divide it by the mean, and then it's reported as a percentage, so we multiply it by 100. And in a lot of field trials, you're going to see around 10 to 15%. And that's really the threshold of where you want to be. If you see an experiment and it says that their CV was 45%, you should start scratching your head and saying, well, my goodness, how much variation is going on in that field? Did they have an outlier? Did they do a bad job of blocking? Because usually that's an indication that either the field was highly variable or the experiment was laid out poorly. But if you look and you see that it's under 10 or 15%, you can be pretty confident that their experimental design did a good job of managing the field variation, and the results that you're seeing are going to be a little bit more reliable. And CV is nice because when you look at just field information, it's tough to tell. So if we've got a corn field that's got a standard deviation of 26 bushels per acre and a soybean field that's got a standard deviation of 11 bushels per acre, which one has more variation? Any guesses? No guesses? The corn? The soybeans? Okay, we're hearing both. So what CV does is it gives you the ability to compare those on an equal level. So the CV in the corn is 15%, whereas in that soybean field with the 11 bushel per acre standard deviation, it's 20%. And so really, even though the standard deviation is smaller for that bean field, the CV is bigger. So there's actually more variation in that field. And that's one of my favorite statistical numbers because it's just a real quick idea of what's going on in that experiment and how well did they manage the variation. So now I want to dig in, now that we've gone over that. Now you have to remember everything we talked about. Did everyone get a handout, the 2 handouts? All right, we're going to go through those. The first one that I want to talk about is the corn performance test. So you have one that says 2016 corn performance and one that says soybean. And we're going to start with the corn performance test. So these are research results that are conducted. They're variety trials conducted by Ohio State Extension. And they're reported every year. I think you might get, if you subscribe to the Ohio Country Journal, this is a special edition that comes out. And so I've just printed some of the results from nearby here so that we can walk through these together. So the first thing we talked about was looking and seeing how the experiment was set up, right? So I'm sorry, the font is really small. Complained to Steve Coleman about that. He'll be here later tell them to make the font bigger. But if we zoom in, what do we want to look for? We want to look for if it was replicated, right? And so it says that at each site, there were 3 replications. And as Jim said earlier, you want to have at least 3, so we're doing pretty well there. And then this is the locations. I believe the one that I printed out for you is the Northwestern, which is in Van Wert County. And you can't see it up here, but what I want you to look at is on the back side of that page at the very bottom, there's going to be a couple numbers that look familiar. So what's the first thing that jumps out to you at the bottom of the page? Well, right there's 4 rows that say the high, average, the low, and then the LSD at 0.1. Do those sound familiar? We talked about those. All right, so remember the LSD tells us what the smallest difference that's real is. So say we're looking at this information and we want to make a decision on what hybrid to select. And we look and we say, well, the LSD in this field is 27.4. And that's in bushels per acre. So how do we use that number? Any guesses? So remember that LSD is the smallest difference that we can say is real because of the variation that went on in that plot. That's a pretty high LSD. So I think the first thing I think is there must have been quite a bit of variation. And I think in the front it tells you that they had some weather issues in this year, and they suggest that you look at the multiple year analysis. But what if you're just trying to decide from varieties that are only in this year, what you would want to do, and you can go ahead and try this on your own, is look for the highest yielding variety in that trial, which was 217.8. And then if you subtract 27.4 from that, that's the yield range that we can say is the same because of the variation. So if you pick anything that is 217.8 minus 27.4, and you circle everything that's higher than that, when you go to make your variety selection, all of those are statistically the same. From this experiment, we cannot say that the differences are caused by anything other than the variation in the field. So if you were to go through this list and circle, I think about half of them in this experiment come out to be statistically the same. So the other thing that's nice is I think in the last column there's a summary. Is that right? I'm having a hard time seeing it. In the last column is a summary, and that is the aggregation of 3 locations. So remember earlier we said if there's more locations, we can do a better job. So what you see is that when there's 3 locations instead of just the 1 location with the high LSD, our LSD goes down pretty significantly. So now we've controlled some of that variation by having multiple locations, and we've got 14 bushels per acre, so a smaller difference. And I think if you look at that, it comes out to about 1/3 of the varieties then that you have to pick from. So let's flip over to the soybean trials and take a look at those because they've got a little bit different setup and information. And what's the first thing we're going to look for? We're going to look for how they designed it, right? So here's our field plot design described at the top of the page. And they replicated it 4 times. There's quite a few locations. I think on this sheet there's, again, they've got 6 different locations in western Ohio where they tested these varieties. So we've got 4 replications at 6 different sites. It's pretty good. And if we look at that table on the back, I've got our early yielding varieties for the central region. And again, at the bottom of the page, they've got it's a different setup. The information reported is a little bit different. But again, what we see is we've got the min, the max, the mean. And then we have an LSD at 0.1 again. And then we have CV. So how do you guys use this information? The same way, right? So we know that LSD is the least significant difference that is real. So if we look at the max and we want to make selections, our maximum yielding variety was 74.2, and our LSD is 6.5 bushels. So that gives us that window again of what the top yielding varieties are that we know are different based on our variation. And then how about that CV number? What do you guys think about a CV of 8.2? Thumbs up or thumbs down? Nobody knows? Thumbs up or thumbs down on 8.2? It does or doesn't? It doesn't? Is it less than 10 or 15%? I saw a thumbs up in the back. We're going to go with thumbs up. If it's less than 10 or 15%, that's a pretty small amount of variation in that plot. So the thing that we always get, right, everybody says, well, that statistical significant, that 12 bushel per acre, 14 that we were just talking about, the 6.5 in beans, that's real to you, right? But it's really, we have to think about it from that variation perspective. And so the first question we have to ask is it real? And that's what statistical significance tells us. And then once we know if it's real, we can then start talking about, is it economically significant? Is it agronomically significant? Those are completely different questions that we need to ask. And we can start talking about how much yield difference is needed to offset the cost of a certain practice that we were testing, or if our yields go down, did we save enough money? And so the last thing I want to cover, and I'm going just about as fast as Jim did, is how to do some research on your own farm and some things to think about. So doing on-farm research is, in my opinion, the best way to find out what's going to work best on your farm. And I think that it's really the only way that you're going to be able to make site-specific precision ag work for you. But it's important when you're doing these trials to take the time to set them up correctly and take a lot of notes, and then make sure that you're collecting your data accurately. So the first thing we have to decide is what is our question? What do we want to learn? What do we want to know? And then once we decide that, we have to determine what treatments do we need and how many. So let's walk through an example of setting up a nitrogen trial, which Jim kind of already spoiled that for us, right? Because he told us how to do it. So you should know all the answers. So if we're going to do a nitrogen trial, how many treatments do you think you need? Any guesses? 2? Is 2 enough? 3 enough? Who thinks 4 is enough? 5? 6? Who doesn't care? Is everybody awake? I think Jim said that 4 is the minimum, and I don't like making, pretty blocks too many times, so we're going to go with 4. So we've got 4 different rates. We've got 0 up there, and our corn's yellow, and 250, that's our best green corn. And so then when we set up the trial, we have to think about our field size, we have to think about how big our plot's going to be, and he had a nice chart of looking at your equipment widths and determining what your plot sizes are going to need to be compatible with your equipment. So you need to take into account your planter width and your other equipment that you're going to be using, your fertilizer applicators. Hopefully if you're doing some early season nitrogen and maybe side dressing, hopefully those line up, your row units. You need to take into account your harvest equipment. And then we need to replicate it and make sure it's randomized for those reasons of managing the variation that we talked about before. So here you can see we've got 4 reps, and with our 4 treatments, they're all mixed up in each of our treatments. And then from my perspective, I think taking lots of notes is really important because that's what's going to make on-farm research really work and make the information that you have even more valuable. So if you collect, in addition to your nitrogen information, if you have weather information and you do this over multiple years, maybe you can get a better idea on your farm of how nitrogen interacts with your crop and then with the environment as well. And I think that's really where the value is going to come as we get better at making predictions and modeling the response. Knowing specifically on your farm how these things respond is going to be endlessly valuable. And so we need to collect accurate data. I did a talk all about accurate data yesterday, but making sure that your yield monitor is calibrated, that your weigh wagons have been checked against a calibrated scale, and moisture meters, make sure that you've got consistent readings between your treatments and your combine. And then there are a lot of tools that are available for all of you to use to help make on-farm research easier for you. Shameless plug, Ohio State has the OSU Plots app, Plots. It's a nice app that if you put in the number of treatments that you want and the number of replications, it's going to help you lay out the plots and randomize and just make that whole process a lot easier. And then at the end of the season, if you come back and input your data into this app, it'll do the statistical analysis for you. So that's a benefit on both ends, easy at the beginning and easy at the end. There are other tools. SMS is pretty good at setting up. That's what I've used in the past to set up trials. Jim was talking about how technology is making this easy. So use the technology that you have. And then Ohio State Extension, we are more than happy to sit down at the beginning of the season and help you set up a trial, help you think through your question and figure out what's going to give you the best chance of getting a result that's going to be valuable to you. So to summarize everything that we just went over, the key take-home points I want you to leave with are that I want you to be critical of all of the information that you're seeing. Even when Curtis gets up here and gives his talk about his research, I want you to think critically about, is he doing it the right way? Is this reliable? Is it going to be useful for me on the farm? So us in Extension are not exempt from your critical eye. So make sure that you're looking and thinking through, how likely am I to see these results? How likely is this information going to be for me, to be useful for me? And look for those signs of good research. Look for multiple years, multiple locations. Look for information about the experimental design. Look for those statistics values. Understand, statistical significance and how that LSD helps you interpret that data. And ask, is it significant? Is it real? Is the first question, and that's what statistical significance tells you. And then, is it significant? Is another question on your farm. And then do your own research. Do research on your farm. Work with us. We love. I'm going to say that probably 3 more times. We love, love, love working with you guys because it's beneficial to us to help advance science in the state of Ohio, and it's beneficial to you to get tailored recommendations for your own farm. So this is one last ad. This is one of my favorites. It says there's got to be a better way to check your soil moisture, right? And the guy's got his head in the ground. And I feel like it's the same way with looking at information. There's a better way to do it. We don't have to just take everything at face value.